it's two different people. All right. So I don't know if you have any questions that you want to ask before we get started, but I think I will finish grading your class's book reviews today, and then the other classes tomorrow, and then I'll probably over the weekend just kind of glance at them and make sure that they all seem, pretty much in scale. I would not expect, once you see your book review grade, that it wouldn't go down. Yeah, it might go up, but probably not that either. The only issue that I'm going to have with anybody's book review is if you plagiarize. So, even if it's bad, no offense, sorry. Or if I think that you didn't really read the book, which I'm not going to lie, I think a couple people didn't really read the book. It doesn't mean that I'll give you, a terrible, well, it does mean you'll get a low grade. It doesn't mean that it's going to affect, anything else in the class. It just means you're not going to get very many points. That's all. And you can always argue with me. You say like, hey, I think you misinterpreted this. I'm okay with that. I've never thought I was always right. I'm often right, but not always. Okay, let's look at the weekly questions just to remind ourselves, unless I close the weekly question. Crud, Serna, why did you close the weekly question? Where is the weekly question? Dang it. Question. I know it's here somewhere. All right, weekly question. Yeah, the last class was telling me that I hadn't really told them that the book review was optional. It's like, oh dear, I'm pretty sure I had. All right, I think I found the weekly questions. Okay, yeah, so we ended class looking over the syllabus again. Okay, weekly questions. The Reagan administration, both domestic and foreign policy, remember to talk about both. Sorry. Domestic is the stuff you do at home. Foreign policy is the away stuff. And don't forget the third part, why he was still popular when he left. And I'm trying to grade those questions. Like if you turn them in early, I'm trying to grade them relatively early. I know some of you have turned some in that I haven't graded, but you turned them in last week, I probably have already graded them. This week, I'll have them graded by Sunday, okay? George W. Bush, I would say Saturday, but I've got like 2 Zoom meetings and a wedding. Oh, who gets married in a pandemic? Question number 2, it's not me, by the way. George W. Bush commented in his 2001 inaugural address that America had gone out into the world to protect, not possess, and defend, not to conquer. Do you agree or disagree with this statement? Give examples to support your position. And the key there is give examples to support your position. You have to give specific examples. Don't say that time when we sent troops overseas or back in the day. A date, a specific event, where we went, why we went. Okay, be specific. Specific. You know what I'm saying. If your answer's like 4 or 5 lines long, it's not going to be long enough. Some of you are still, not very many of you, but some of you are still putting in answers that are shorter than my question. And then you're getting like 2 or 3 points, and I'm sure you're wondering, like, why is she so stingy? It's because I took longer to write the question than you did the answer. You know what I'm saying. Don't be lazy. All right, and then on question number 2, it doesn't have to be stuff that happened in the Bush administration, because he says this the first day of his administration, so he's not necessarily referring to stuff that he does. Now, you can certainly talk about stuff that he does and assess where that fits in. Is that protect and defend, or is that possess and conquer? And it's pretty easy for people in the United States to argue that we don't possess and conquer because technically we don't have a very large empire, although I know Spanish-American War, but we certainly do control certain countries. We certainly do have territories that are not states. There's no doubt about that. And you could go back all the way, I mean, as far back as you want to, but you also don't want to write 5 pages about this either. I would hope that whatever you talk about happened during the class that this semester. I'd rather you didn't go back pre-Civil War. You don't have to go back that far either. You can just talk about the Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush, if you like. So, and you can talk about stuff after Bush if you want. I don't care, but I do care if you have examples. I would also suggest that even if you say, we're really protecting and defending, we're not possessing and conquering, you might want to acknowledge a time or two that it looked like we were possessing and conquering. If you're saying, no, we do possess and conquer, you might want to acknowledge that there were times that maybe we did really just protect and defend. I mean, it's hard. I don't know. Can you argue that we went to Bosnia to possess and conquer? I bet you can't, but maybe you can. I don't know. But don't ignore the other side of the argument. At least acknowledge it a little, okay? And then number 3, I've highlighted the presidential campaign part because some of the ones I've read are really comparing their presidencies, which isn't the end of the world, but it's also not exactly what the question's asking. So presidential campaign, okay, so how they ran their campaign. So we're looking for use of technology, fundraising, television use, that sort of thing. That's what we're looking for. Maybe who they picked as advisors, how diverse were their groups, that sort of thing. Potentially. There are other things you could talk about, personalities, emphasis on change, hope and change, or drain the swamp, either way. All right, any questions or comments thus far? You guys make me nervous. Are you even there? Now, I always see that I'm in a couple of teacher groups online, and one of them, there's always this meme posted where teaching nowadays is like running a seance. Can I raise any voices? Is anyone there? Like, no, I appreciate you guys answering. Okay, let's go with notes then. Yeah, notes. All right, since you guys don't have any questions. All right, I feel like we were just about to talk about one of my favorite things ever to talk about in US history, the Clinton impeachment. What was Bill Clinton thinking? Don't answer that question. But Bill Clinton. Okay, so Clinton presidency is usually seen as okay or good, mostly, because the economy was good, mostly, and he was personable. People tended to like him, mostly. There are a few minor scandals, perhaps, and then impeachment. Now, impeachment. He did not get impeached because he had an affair. He did get impeached because he lied under oath about having an affair. Now, some of you go, of course he lied about having an affair because, it's the whole nature of having an affair that you keep it secret so you don't advertise it. I get it. But here's the deal. He was being sued for sexual harassment for some previous issues at his previous jobs in elected positions. Sorry for yawn, in Arkansas. Oh, sorry. That thing I said when I yawned was Arkansas. And the women who had filed the lawsuit, they were all women, said that, they wanted the lawsuit to proceed even though he'd been elected president. And the court said, yeah, I can proceed even though he's been elected president. And he argued, like, can't we wait until I'm not president anymore and we could take care of this then? And the court said, no, we will take care of it now. So he gets deposed under oath while he's president. So they send a lawyer and they tape the deposition and he has to swear that he's telling the truth and nothing but the truth. So help him God. And then they ask him, have you sexually harassed anyone? And he says no. And they go like, how about this intern you have right now, Monica Lewinsky? And they're like, nah, she's just size pizza, or, whatever. I don't know what he said. I watched it. But he says no. Now, they already have evidence that he does know her. And she's been interviewed as well. And she has articles of clothing that seem to have his DNA on there somehow. You can read about that if you like. And she also can describe certain body parts that are not typically visible when you meet the president. So it made the people that interviewed her think that they maybe had an affair. So they're able to prove that Mr. Clinton was lying, that he had not known her. And because he lied under oath, it's perjury. So lying under oath is a crime. I don't know if it's a high crime. It's definitely a misdemeanor. So, and our Constitution says that we can impeach presidents and other federal officials for high crimes and misdemeanors. Now, the Congress was more Republican than Democrat during this time period. We'd had one midterm election, which brought in a whole bunch of Republicans, and those were in the House. And you know, every 2 years, the entire House is up for re-election. And so those guys really have to make a name for themselves all the time so that you'll continue to vote for them. The Senate terms are 6 years, so they have 6 years, you know, to make a name or at least get you used to them, however you want to look at it. So this group of Republicans had run under something called the Contract with America. They'd promised to cut taxes. They actually signed a contract, and I think there were 10 things on it. Your book talks about it. They agreed to cut taxes, limit spending on education, environmental stuff, medical care, because either those things don't matter. That's not what they said. Although, no, that's not what they said. Or because those are the largest budget items. So to cut the budget, you have to cut those things. So cutting spending on those things, adding term limits, a balanced budget amendment, which doesn't necessarily mean you've got to pay off the debt. It means that this year you can't spend more than you take in. And we do that 1 or 2 years during the Clinton administration. They pay off a little bit of the national debt. But I always have students who think that they paid off the entire national debt during the Clinton administration. It's like, no. We have not paid off the entire national debt in some time. And I would not expect that anytime soon, because our national debt's the same as our gross national product now. It's pretty high. So the Republicans win the House, and that means they get to pick the Speaker of the House, because the whole House votes on the Speaker of the House, which means that it's going to be the majority party. So they pick a fellow from Georgia named Newt Gingrich. He is not named after a lizard. It's short for Newton. And he's not a science guy, although he could be, right? With the name Newton, he should be. But he's a history professor from Georgia. And he's a very intelligent fellow. He's not, probably, if you know anything about him, he's probably not the most ethical person in US history, not the most moral guy, not the worst either. But he's going to be kind of the spokesman for conservatism, and we'll see him on television quite a bit. And you still see him. He's older, but you still see him on television quite a bit. His wife is an ambassador now, ambassador to the Vatican. That's who it's like, to the Pope, to the Vatican, which is sort of a country. All right. So these guys really push a more conservative version of politics, and Clinton's kind of in the middle anyway, so he's going to go along with several of the things that they propose. All right, so they want to make a name for themselves. The House gets to decide if you're going to impeach the president. So when this idea is presented to them, they go, heck yeah, let's get the Democrat out. So they vote for an impeachment trial. The Senate holds the impeachment trial. They tend to be more conservative, and I don't mean more Republican, I mean conservative. They're not as likely to take a big action. So they're not overly excited that they get impeachment. So when the trial is over, they just go like, nope, and they do not vote to convict him. So in that way, it was similar to the Trump impeachment, where the House is pretty gung-ho because there's more Democrats and they got the 2-year terms, and it's like, we got to get him out of here. We hate Trump. So, and I'm not saying that it's, I wasn't trying to say that what Trump was accused of was quite as, it's not the same as what Clinton was accused of, but I'm saying that politically, the the opposite party controlled the House and the same party controlled the Senate. So when the Republicans in the Senate got to the Trump impeachment, they just went, nah. And when the Democrats, but honestly, everyone in the Senate got to the Clinton impeachment, they went, nah. And typically, the Senate is less inclined to want to follow through on impeachment than the House, which is why it starts in the House but ends in the Senate. Okay. So Clinton's in trouble with his wife. He looks bad to the country because he's denied that he had anything to do with Monica Lewinsky. And then we find out a lot of details that he had a lot to do with Monica Lewinsky, and it makes him look bad. And it does. Yeah. So there you go. And they'll finish the sexual harassment lawsuit after his presidency, and he'll settle with them. So he takes a plea agreement essentially and gives up his law license to practice at the Supreme Court and something else, I can't remember, but yeah. All right, so he probably did that. He did that. And he's hoping that you'll remember his presidency as a time where crime went down and the economy got better and people worked together a little better, and that's not typically what we remember about his presidency. Okay, some other stuff you might potentially remember about his presidency. We send the troops a lot of places. Balkans, Rwanda, and we don't send, I put Rwanda in there? We didn't send them. Crud, I need to take that out. Why didn't you people tell me? We have the opportunity to send them to Rwanda, but we don't. We send them to Somalia, the Balkans. I wrote down the page number where you could look. Let's see. 1082 is where it talks a little bit about Clinton's foreign policy, but we send Serbia. Well, that's the Balkans, isn't it? But in those instances, we're sending troops places to stop ethnic cleansing. Now, we're sending troops, the normal places we send troops during that time period as well, to the Middle East. We still have the Air Force or the military bases where we always have the military bases. Sorry, I'm looking at 101082. You know, I forgot to mention to the last class, the Clinton also ushers in this don't ask, don't tell policy for the military, which before this time period, if you were openly gay, you couldn't serve in the military. And so the Clinton era policy is we're just not asking and we don't want you to say anything. So it's not dramatically different. It's just more of a we're not going to look and just don't tell us. And then in the modern era, it's like, yeah, we don't care. So, but this is Clinton's kind of the transition for that. I need to talk about that maybe in the other classes. All right, but world affairs, you'll notice some times where it looks like we're making good moves politically, good moves with foreign policy. We were just trying to help people out. And then at other times, it looks like we're just doing the same things that we always do. You know, there's always troops in the Middle East. There's always troops in Germany. There's always troops Korea. There's certain places there are always troops. Yeah, U.S. troops. Japan, there's always troops there. And then Clinton sends them several different places to kind of break up things that are going on. Now, the Rwanda thing is, it's a civil war in Rwanda where nearly 1 million people get killed and over 1 million people become refugees because of the civil war. And we ignore that, probably because it's poorer and not as close to some of our other allies. Somalia was closer to some of our allies. Excuse me, sorry. All right. I assume you are all down with this computer revolution and globalization. So the idea that everything's a little more connected, a lot more connected, and that we can have these connections instantly. Like, I don't know, before class, I was talking to a friend of mine who's in Brazil. And, you know, normally, when I was a kid, that wouldn't have been as possible. Could have been a phone call, maybe would have probably cost me a day's wages. It would have been really expensive. And now I can just get on my phone or my computer and send a message. And I don't speak a lot of Portuguese, and she only speaks Portuguese, but I've got a thing that translates it. And, it's stuff's easy. We're really connected now. That also means that businesses tend to be more international. So you can sell stuff overseas if you can ship it overseas, but also multinational corporations are pretty normal. I mean, they're pretty common. I don't know if they're normal, but they're common. So maybe you've got a company like Nike that has its headquarters in somewhere in the Northwest. It's either Washington or Oregon. I think it's Oregon. To me, they're the same state. I'm sorry. That's one of the parts of the country I haven't lived in. You know how it is if you haven't lived in that part of the country, all the states, you don't know. But anyway, I'm sorry. I know, I just admitted my ignorance of some stuff. So Nike has headquarters in the United States, but they make most of their gear in not the United States, probably China. And sometimes that causes issues, like when we find out that our $200 tennis shoes are made by people that make 5 cents an hour and could never afford the $200 tennis shoes. And sometimes when that stuff gets publicized, then maybe there's a push to improve working conditions. But as a rule, we just want what we want. And sometimes we want it cheaply. Sometimes we just want the right brand, that sort of thing. But globalization, probably good, probably bad. It's probably both. It's part of the reason that manufacturing jobs have moved out of countries that pay higher wages into countries that pay lower wages. It's true. All right. But it's also part of the reason you can buy stuff from all over the world if you want to, and have connections with people from all over the world. So, all right. And information gets processed faster, and except in China, you have access to all kinds of global information. They really don't in China. My nephew taught in China for a while. He's trying to pay off his student loans. Oh my gosh, you kids and your student loans. Because he couldn't find a job. Well, you know how this works. You got to major in the right stuff where you can get a job. He's not on this call, so I'll talk about it. He majored in museum studies. That's a beautiful job. I mean, a beautiful thing to study, because, he made these beautiful displays at a history museum, and I got to go see them and take pictures. It's like, this is the greatest thing. And then he was unemployed because it's hard to find a job working in a museum. It's like you majoring in archaeology. We don't have a lot of digs going on. You know what I'm saying? Or you majoring in history. I went to school with a bunch of people who majored in history or got their master's in history, and they go, well, I'm never going to teach. It's like, yeah, then you're going to be unemployed. Okay. So my nephew, museum studies, was teaching English in China. There's a need for that, apparently, and enjoyed that quite a bit, and had to be very cautious about what sort of things he communicated with us back in the United States, because they did notice those things. I know the US government looks at those things too, but not in quite the same way. Not in the we'll run over you with a tank or put you in prison forever sort of way. As a rule, I know some of you are going like, I don't know if you're watching the news. I know, but it's more the exception than the policy, although I know some of you would argue with that as well. And, you could do that, and you would have reason. All right, back to business. Computer revolution and globalization changes everything. And then contract with America, we've already talked about that. So a bunch of Republicans come in, pushes the government to be more conservative, and then Clinton goes with it. And I know that I've already talked to you about the 3 strikes law too much last time, probably, and reminded you that Clinton signed that and that Biden was a co-sponsor. But, the Republican-led Congress was quite fond of that as well. So I'm not trying to just blame Democrats, just blame Republicans. That was culturally what we were doing during this time period. I'm not saying it's okay, but there was not a lot of pushback, and there surely is now. Okay, so Contract with America brings in this kind of new conservatism that's more radical than the Reagan type of conservatism, which now looks kind of mealy and wishy-washy. It also brings in that Rush Limbaugh fellow. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but my dad used to listen to him all the time. And he was pretty sure they were friends. He listened to him every day. So I think he still has a radio show. I don't listen to him every day or ever, to be honest. Because I'm with you. Yeah, I'm sure I would normally listen to political commentary on the radio or not. Okay, because you need a break sometimes, right? Okay, so conservative era, even the Democrats, fairly conservative, the ones who are in charge. Cultural changes, this is a bulk of this chapter, is about cultural changes, about how we're skewing younger, there's more immigrants, we are moving, that our segregation is different during this time period. There's a big discussion of this, which I think is pretty interesting stuff. So I think this chapter is going to be kind of an easy read for you. I think it'll go pretty quickly. So, and some of you are going, good, because I need to read a chapter and I haven't done it yet. Well, this is your chapter. So read it. You'll like it. The things that you'll notice, a lot of new immigrants during this time period. The book also, this chapter also talks about turmoil throughout the world, especially, well, Africa, some African nations, several are having civil wars. I know one of our soccer trainers is from Cameroon, in large part because they're having a civil war and it's not safe to be there. So I know I have soccer league, you meet some immigrants there. We have a group of families from Albania who came during the era we're talking about now, late 90s, early 2000s, because that's when their government was in turmoil and that region was in a lot of turmoil. And, we're always going to have people from Central and South America and Mexico as well, because we're close and because, well, mostly because we're close. And when the economy is better in certain countries, people will come or leave, that sort of thing. So lots of new immigrants, 38 million during the 90s and 2000s, and lots of folks who are not your standard Christian or Jewish, your moral majority kind of folks. So we have lots of Muslim immigrants, Hindu immigrants, Buddhist immigrants. So folks who probably aren't as Western European. And African Americans had long been the largest minority group, and they'll be the third largest during this era, second largest being Hispanics or Latinos, Latinx. You put the whole group together, realizing that the biggest thing that most people in this group have in common is that they come from a country that speaks Spanish. But you've probably noticed if you listen to people talk about election results, that does not mean that everybody from the same country behaves the same way, votes the same way. Some folks are more conservative, some folks are more liberal. And that, of course, is true in any immigrant group, and it's true in any cultural group as well, although you can see trends about certain things. Okay. Asian Americans see substantial growth, so you have a lot of Chinese immigrants during this time period, as well as Vietnamese and Korean and other Asian countries. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there. I apologize. All right. African immigration, so from African countries, increases as well. And this is more urban than rural, but everything's more urban than rural at this point. I mean, we mostly live in cities or are near cities. I think over 50% of the population in the United States lives in 20 urban areas. So people go where there are jobs as a rule. I mean, there are certain exceptions to that. Sometimes people come over because they want to be farmers. It doesn't happen very often. Or they want to live in a certain area with their relatives, and maybe that's a little more suburban or rural, but typically people immigrate to cities. This cultural change is going to change how classes that are offered at school a little bit. It's going to change the emphasis in your history classes. You may have noticed this if you're younger, that certain history classes really start to, world history classes, and maybe I forget what it's called, world civilizations, whatever your 6th grade history class is, So your 10th grade history and your 6th grade history is going to talk more about Asian countries and then more about Islamic countries or Islam as an influence in certain countries. So you see more emphasis on that than certainly than when I was a kid, when we just pretended that Asia didn't exist. And there were no religions except for Judaism and Christianity. Of course, I also grew up in a very conservative part in the middle of the country. However, I think what we teach has changed. Also, arguments over what we teach has changed, or have changed. And the book talks about how segregation has changed during this era. So it's not necessarily ethnic or racial, but it is necessarily socioeconomic. And I mean, every one of us live that every day. I know when I taught the last school I taught at was a little more affluent than the other schools that I taught at. And some of you are going like, hey, I went to that school and I wasn't that affluent. Yeah, you were wealthy, just admit it. But I had taught at some pretty poor rural schools. I had taught at some inner city schools. And I taught a high school out in the same district that when I first started teaching out here was very much a rural school and not very affluent. So, I went from those experiences to a school where I would guess, the average person in that school probably lived in a $500,000 home. That would not surprise me. Not saying that if you're in this class, that's where you grew up. I know there are other options in that school district, but there were 2 or 3 country clubs adjacent to the school district property. And I would tell the students, I said, you guys really segregate out here. And they go like, no, Brown versus Board of Education, and that's illegal. And I go, you got a sign at the beginning of your neighborhood that says the houses begin at 500,000. That keeps most of the population out. So, and the Supreme Court has even ruled that in recent years, it wasn't the Trump administration, but the Obama administration, that government-assisted housing has to move into more affluent areas, because typically they would put what they refer to as Section 8 housing in poorer areas, so those kids would always go to poorer schools. Like, I can tell you exactly where it was in the school district that I taught in. It was definitely not right next to the last school I taught at, but it is right across the street from the first school I taught at. And I can tell you where it is, where I grew up, and you can guess why I would know that. But I can tell you that typically it's not in Westlake, and it's typically not in Lake Travis, and it's typically not next to Vandegrift High School in the district that I formerly taught in. But now the Supreme Court says it has to be, that they have to build government-assisted housing in all of those areas to give everybody the same educational opportunities. So kind of some interesting changes that are not necessarily popular with people in all neighborhoods. So I don't know, kind of interesting maybe. But what you'll notice too is that, and the book talks about, I think they've got a song in there from Los Tigres del Norte, I think is what it is. And it talks about, oh, I can't remember the name of the song, something about gold, oro. But it's about, and they've got an excerpt of it in your book, but it talks about first generation immigrants, about how they don't feel welcome back in the home country where they might be sending money, and they don't feel at home in the new country either. It talks about that displacement of being a first or maybe second generation immigrant. And I don't know, that's kind of an interesting thing. And the chapter talks about that quite a bit. What is an American, and how does our definition of that change in this era? And how do you feel as you go from being an immigrant to becoming an American? And, at what point are you an American? And what happens when your kids embrace the new culture and not the culture you brought with you? And how does that work? And that's tricky stuff. My husband was third generation, so his parents were born in the United States, but all his grandparents were born in Mexico. And his parents primarily spoke Spanish. They were migrant farmers, West Texas originally, but then moved all up and down the country wherever the crops were. And my husband did the migrant farming gig just really more in the summers because they had become affluent by that time. So he only had to work in the cotton fields in the summers, which everyone he ever coached in soccer got to hear about when they complained about how hard the workouts were. It's like, you want to know what hard is? And then we'd all get a cotton field story. His family, like his generation and his family, the older ones spoke primarily Spanish. My husband was in the second group. There were 8 of them. The younger ones spoke primarily English, but the first 3 were fluent in Spanish, the 4th one not so much. And then the next generation, my niece and nephew generation, is only 1 nephew, and there's 7 nieces. They do not speak Spanish. They do not speak Spanish at all. And their lives were not very Hispanic, except, you know, for occasional food and swearing. You know, they didn't have they definitely were not migrant farmers. A couple of them went to private school. They all went to college or post-secondary education. Nobody worked in the cotton fields, I guarantee you that. And that, you know, their lives and their culture very different. And I know that my husband's parents are still alive. My husband is not, but my husband's parents are still alive. They're in their 90s, and their connection with their grandchildren is not very strong. It just isn't, and it's because culture and language differences. And I know I had students who families had recently immigrated, and they lived with other families of the same culture, and some of them picked out who their kids were going to marry, and the kids were not super excited about that. So, you know, there's changes that happen when you leave your home and your culture behind. You clearly bring your culture with you, but it's no longer the culture of your children and your grandchildren. And there's like a feeling of disillusionment or loneliness or something. And the book talks about that. I'm pointing over here because my book's over here. But the book talks about that quite a bit. And I will also say, I mean, it's a different cultural experience. I mean, it's fairly clear I'm white, right? I'm a fairly white person. And I'm from a part of the Midwest that's a pretty white place, except Oklahoma, where, you know, we shoved all the Native Americans because it was crappy land. And I do have some relatives that wandered over there and met people. So I have some cousins. Well, I'm, you know, partly, but, you know, I have cousins who dance at powwows and have tribal registration, that kind of stuff. But I, you know, certainly was not a cultural experience for me. But I will say that growing up in what you would probably consider extreme poverty, but growing up in poverty and then going to college was a huge cultural shift for my relatives, several of whom really don't accept me at all. And, you know, if I go back to visit, it's like she thinks she's better than us. She thinks she knows everything. She thinks because she went to college, she's above this all, and she can't even change a tire, which probably is true, by the way. I really can't change a tire. Or, you know, she can't grow things or fix things. That's true. I mean, I have a family that can grow things and fix things, mostly legal stuff, but occasionally not. But, you know, it creates a cultural divide as well. So, you know, sometimes moving out of poverty when the rest of the family is kind of, my immediate family isn't, but my extended family is still in, also creates a cultural divide, which it's kind of a weird thing. But I know you guys have experienced that. And from what I've read from some of your comments and your book reviews, it's like some of you can really relate to some of that stuff. All right, back to business. But the culture definitely changes and shifts, and we have, you know, the younger part of our culture tends to be more immigrant influenced or immigrant based. The older part of the culture and the more affluent part of the culture not having as many children, and I don't know, it's just you're seeing a cultural change, a cultural shift, and a cultural kind of mesh, I suppose, where different ideas and thoughts are coming together, which I think is why you see such a clash between certain groups politically and certain socioeconomic groups politically. But you also have noticed that the newer, wealthier people are a big part of the global economy, technical revolution, that sort of thing. And they see the world in a completely different way. So All right, but all of those things merging and those people becoming more involved politically, and you definitely have seen that in the last couple of election cycles where you see really young, more liberal Democrats, and in this cycle, really young, more conservative Republicans getting elected. And I don't know, it's a different combination of cultural and political thought. So interesting stuff. It's increasingly diverse, which I think is why we're having more arguments in some ways. All right, I know I talked too much last time about this 3 strikes and you're out sort of thing. This happens in the Clinton administration, certainly created by the Congress, approved by the president. One of the co-sponsors in the Senate was you-know-who, Joe Biden, which is why it's come up quite a bit. And it does lead to increased imprisonment for certain types of drug offenses, and certainly there's been a lot of pushback to that since. Political discord and national culture becomes increasingly strident. That, of course, has been completely fixed. No one argues. Okay, that's still a huge mess, isn't it? It is a big mess. All right.
Sit down.
Uh-oh. Was somebody in trouble? One of the things that you've probably...
It was my fox.
Your fox? You have a fox? Did you say F-O-X?
Yes.
Okay, then. Yeah, I don't have one of those. So, I have a lot of squirrels on the back porch, which is why I get distracted sometimes, but no fox. Okay. Well, there you go. Now I'm going to check the chat to see what kind of pets other people have. Okay, yes, somebody wants to see a picture of the fox. He probably can't catch it, I don't know. Although he did tell it to get down, and I bet it minded. So, gay marriage, let's talk about that while someone locates a picture of their fox. So, when I was a kid, 100 years ago, the country is super conservative. I've already told you a million times I was born in the middle of the 60s. And I know that wasn't the most conservative time in history, but when I was born, where I was born was conservative. It became increasingly more liberal and then strident, and then we didn't trust the government, and then we were conservative again in the 80s and kind of in the 90s. And the 80s brought the AIDS epidemic where we started to talk about people being gay, and still maybe not in the most positive ways. That'll be my understatement of the day. And then, to the point where people would say, like, I don't want to do research on AIDS because that just helps gay people, and we don't want to help gay people, and it's a plague on gay people. And so, we heard that in the 80s. And then in the 90s, it's like, hey, maybe we shouldn't be jerks about this, and we should be more helpful. And why do you want to harass somebody because they're gay? And then there's a conservative pushback in the 90s. So 96 was, let's see, who was president in 96? That was Clinton. So in the Clinton era, they passed the Defense of Marriage Act, which Barack Obama was in favor of and talks about at the beginning of his presidency and says, I'm in favor of the Defense of Marriage Act and opposed to gay marriage. So, I'm pointing that out to say how recent that opinion is. And then the Supreme Court will rule that the Defense of Marriage Act is unconstitutional during one of the Obama terms. I think it's end of the first. And President Obama, of course, will go along with that ruling, and then we'll later talk about how his mind had been changed about that. But, this isn't, I don't want to say this isn't the result of a push for gay rights, because there certainly is a push for gay rights that starts back in the 60s and maybe a little earlier. Some of you, read about Bayard Rustin or James Baldwin, who certainly, were open and pushing for certain things that were not mainstream about their sexuality. But what really makes the big change in this is the Supreme Court, which is relatively conservative, not extremely, but relatively conservative. They go like, you can't make a law that says marriage is for men and women. That's not no. What part of the Constitution seems to support that? And then because that was declared unconstitutional, the opposite was assumed to be true. I mean, and I don't mean that in a like we were guessing, I'm saying in a legal sense. So gay marriage, there you go. Or civil unions, that sort of thing. And so I think in the 20th century, that's become more accepted. I am not saying that, I mean, because you've got relatives, we've all got those old relatives that say stuff that we don't want to hear, although you didn't get to hear them at Thanksgiving, did you? But, you know, there's always people who feel differently, but I think the general consensus and certainly the legal consensus is gay marriage is fine. And you see an expansion of those rights in a pretty rapid way in some ways because of the Supreme Court ruling. Partly my opinion, but partly fact, Supreme Court ruling. Clap back for Thanksgiving. Does that mean you met with the older relatives for Thanksgiving? I don't know. I must have been completely rejected at Thanksgiving because I did not have a single relative ask me to come over, which is, that tells you everything you need to know, right? So I went over to a friend's house and it was very entertaining. I'm not going to lie, but you know, it is it is weird to not have your own family invite you over and then go to somebody else's family. It's like, man, they're way different, but at least they wanted me over there, right? I don't know. I think it was mostly, they were more athletic. So I think it was mostly so they'd have somebody play a game with them and they could beat me soundly, which they did. But thankfully it was just croquet. Oh yeah. Crud, if you talked at all about politics this year at the holidays, oh dang. I'll be honest, that's part of what I went to visit my immediate family, which is still more conservative than me. They're not the MAGA hat group of my family, and no offense at all if you are the MAGA hat people. God bless you, God bless America, all that stuff. Not trying to be rude at all, but I got the MAGA hat version, and then we quietly like Trump but don't want to admit it, which is essentially my immediate family. And then with me, it's like I hate all politicians. So they just look at me like you've really lost your mind. So when I went to visit the we quietly like Trump version of the family, they're just like, how could you vote for Biden? And how do you like this? And it's like, we hadn't had the election yet, so I hadn't voted for anybody. And I just looked at him like, why do any of you care? It's like, why are you all yelling at me about my political, yeah. So maybe that's why I didn't get invited anywhere for Thanksgiving. I don't know, but sorry if you're, you know, we shouldn't talk about family stuff, should we? But I think the more open discussion of things that previously had been really, you know, things you didn't talk about, like gay marriage, like people who weren't Christian or Jewish, you know, it's like, no, Muslims don't actually exist. You know, just the idea that you could accept people and things and ideas that are different than yours is uncomfortable at best to people. So you do see a pushback to that. And just like the idea that if there's gay marriage, it somehow threatens your marriage. Oh no. Are you guys still there? Something weird happened to my computer. Oh my gosh, did I turn you off?
Yes, we're still here.
Oh, thank God. Yeah, there's something weird that happened to my computer as I pressed the power button. So that was my fault. Yeah. Okay, sorry. But no, I do think once we start accepting or talking about different things, which does lead to change. I mean, it's part of, I'll say out loud my opinion, it's part of the reason I think people in the Deep South didn't want desegregation. Because once people of different groups started meeting together, they're going to like each other and they're going to accept each other. And then that has to change your worldview if we no longer hate people because they're Black or because they're gay, or we think that everybody who's Hispanic is a certain way, or everybody who's a Republican is a jerk, or everybody who's a Democrat is a jerk. You know, once we meet people that are different than us and we go like, hey, they're not so bad, they're mostly like us, you know, we both like tacos, or whatever you have in common, and who doesn't like tacos. But you know, we tend to have a lot more in common than we have that's different, which I don't know, if I could get everyone to distrust all politicians, I would feel better. All right, sorry. Random crises. I think one of the weirdest things, and I really didn't mean to talk about Thanksgiving so long there. They made the turkey on the grill, by the way, on the grill. It was pretty good. I've never had turkey from the grill. It was good. Okay. And coconut cream pie. Does that sound like a Thanksgiving pie? I don't know. It was fine though. It's good. Okay. Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas. This was one of the strangest things from my generation politically. George W. Bush, Old Bush, appointed Clarence Thomas to replace Thurgood Marshall. So you had the first African American on the Supreme Court. He's retiring mostly because he's old and getting sick, but he said also to work on the 200th anniversary of the Bill of Rights, which he did do. I mean, he wasn't lying. But usually those folks hang on till they die, as we've seen a lot in the modern era, the last two presidencies. But Thurgood Marshall's out. George Herbert Walker Bush understands that if the one African American member of the Supreme Court is going, you should probably replace him with another African American. George H.W. Bush is a fairly conservative guy, so he's got to find a really conservative black guy, and there's one. Okay, there's more than one, but there are. It's not a very common thing. So he finds Clarence Thomas, who's your just standard, I went to Yale and got my law degree and was a justice, you know, a lawyer and a judge and all that sort of stuff. Super smart guy, rose from poverty, great personal story, and he's, you know, he gets nominated, they have the hearings and everything seems fine. And then Anita Hill says, that dude sexually harassed me. And Anita Hill lives kind of a quiet life. She's not out in the public. She's also a law professor at a university, and she seems completely credible. They both, of course, are brilliant, well-spoken, live those quiet conservative lives. And by that, I don't mean they're Republicans. I mean, they just keep to themselves sort of things. They're not in the news. They're not flashy. You know, they just live their life. So when they interview Anita Hill and she talks about the things that Clarence Thomas did, she seems embarrassed. She, you know, seems like she didn't really want to talk about it, and she seems credible. And then Clarence Thomas, who doesn't say anything during all this time, because, you know, in part the way that it's structured, in part because that's the way Clarence Thomas kind of runs his life. He doesn't talk a lot. He does write quite a bit, and doesn't talk a lot because he didn't grow up speaking standard English. He grew up in island areas of Georgia and South Carolina where they spoke Gullah. And if you're old enough, there was apparently a PBS show with Gullah Island or something, but that's kind of the area that he's from. So when he got the first chance to speak, he said that what was happening was a high-tech lynching of uppity N-words who don't know their place in society. And it's like, oh crap, it's on now. And both of these guys, well-educated, completely credible, and one of them had to be lying. There were not any witnesses who came up and said, yeah, Clarence Thomas talked about porn all the time at work and, you know, did this kind of stupid stuff to me too. And there was no one else that came up and said, hey, Anita Hill is a big liar and she's always making crap up. So nobody had any idea who was telling the truth. And another slight controversy. You know, this is what happens when you're in politics forever. One of the people who supported Clarence Thomas is about to be president. so oops. But he's narrowly confirmed Clarence Thomas 52-48 after a very intense and controversial series of hearings, which I think was, to me, was probably more dramatic than the Gorsuch hearings because of the, you know, there really wasn't a good challenge to the credibility of Anita Hill. And she was, you know, there wasn't anything sketchy about either. It was tricky. It was weird and really dramatic, really dramatic. And certainly not controversial the same way that the Amy Coney Barrett hearings were, which she's completely legitimately qualified. I mean, nobody argued that. It's just the timing, really. But anyway, So Clarence Thomas gets confirmed. And it's pretty dramatic stuff. It's really dramatic stuff, no doubt. All right, I feel like I'm done talking about this stuff. Oh, I forgot. This little part of the Bush notes is in the wrong section because it's really the end of chapter 27. So we'll talk a little bit more about Bush and 9/11 and that kind of stuff next time, but I will mention to you, because we still have time, that the 2000 election, Bush versus Gore, closest in US history to that point. Yeah, no, that it is the closest in US history. It was less than half a percentage point popular vote, and the outcome was really going to be determined by a county or two in Florida, which makes this different than the concerns about votes and recounts in the current election. You know, there are certainly people who are going to be able to find instances of fraud in any election, or instances where it's hard to tell what the voter's intent was, not so much in the modern era, in part because of what happens in this election. But in this election, you know, it wasn't, well, you know, there was a truck in Georgia and there was a truck in Pennsylvania and there were some voting machines in Michigan. You know, it's not like small things in 8 different states. This was all concentrated in one state. So in some ways, this is going to be an easier problem to prove if there's something to prove, and an easier problem to solve because it's just one area and it's really one problem. So I don't know if that makes any sense. But the local and state and federal courts kept arguing about what should be counted, what shouldn't be counted. They used these punch card ballots, and you were supposed to punch it hard enough that all of the piece of the ballot went through, and sometimes they didn't make the hole in the ballot. So then the people who were looking at the cards were going like, oh my gosh, who did he mean to vote for? And there was a county in Florida, I think it was Palm Beach County, which is primarily old people, old retired people that are wealthy, because I think it's really expensive to live there. There were a lot of people there that it looks like they voted for, you know, either all Democrats or all Republicans, but they picked a guy named Pat Buchanan for president, who was an independent, who wasn't even on every state ballot. And there were a whole bunch of Pat Buchanan ballots, and people like, oh, so that's a mistake. Who and how would this many people in their right minds vote for Pat Buchanan? No offense if you're a big Pat Buchanan fan. So it was really kind of confusing. Eventually it goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court takes it and says the most accurate count appeared to them to be, you know, a certain count, and it favored George Bush. So Bush was president. So then people said he was selected and not elected, and it was fairly controversial. And he says, you know what, I don't care, I'm in, we got to fix the economy. And then he, of course, gives that speech, which is for your weekly question. That's not why he gave the speech, but it's considered in your weekly question. And then he says, you know what, biggest tax cut in history, let's get this economy rolling, which means he kind of subscribes to that supply side or trickle down or Reaganomics kind of theory. And you know, maybe or maybe not, the economy starts to pick up. We don't have quite long enough to find out before 9/11 happened. And then the Bush Doctrine is issued, and it's the idea of a preemptive war. So not a declared war. Well, it's not so much that. You're not waiting until a country attacks you. You're preventing the attack from happening. So you're getting them before they get you. And this is going to be fairly controversial. And we are going to declare a war on terror, not a war on Afghanistan, not a war on Iraq, not a war on Saudi Arabia, where most of the hijackers were born, but a war on terror. And then Bush will also declare that there's an axis of evil that supports these terrorist countries. We're going to send troops to Afghanistan and Iraq primarily because we believe those were the countries that harbored the terrorists and then supported them economically, allowed them to train, that sort of thing. And that will lead to 20 years of troops being in Iraq and Afghanistan, where they still are, and where I strongly suspect a few of you got to visit. And we'll also pass the Patriot Act at the same time, which allows the government, and Patriot's an acronym for a whole bunch of stuff, and I'll make sure that I put that up on the screen next time. I never can remember what it is because, quite honestly, every letter of Patriot and ACT stands for something, and I just don't remember what it is. But which was clever. Can you imagine how long they must have sat around and thought about that? But it really gives them the chance to spy on your electronic communication and phone calls, to make sure that you are not planning stuff. So, and right after 9/11, I think a lot of people were okay with this. As time goes along, they're probably less okay with this because it allows for warrantless wiretaps and searches of your house and your technology, that kind of stuff. And secret courts, and they're not, well, they are kind of secret courts. But anyway, we'll talk more about that next time, perhaps. Perhaps we will. Okay. All right, let me remind you of the weekly question really quick, and then I will double check the roll, and then we can be done or look at pictures of the fox. Okay, weekly question, George W. Bush, inaugural address. Inaugural address is that first time you get in, like they're swearing you in, and then you give a speech. And he said that we had gone into the world not to protect, not possess, and defend, not conquer. And this is, of course, before he's done anything as president. So he's talking about the US historically, which means to answer this question, if you agree or disagree, you can talk about things that happened before he was president. And I honestly don't mind if you talk about things that happen after he's president. What you have to do is have examples, specific examples of times that we went to other places to either protect and defend or possess and conquer. You pick. And if I were you, whatever side I pick, I'd still acknowledge the other side with at least one event. You know what I'm saying to you? Hopefully. All right. Let me double check the roll before you guys go and see if you have any questions.